Thank you for joining us today, Alison, to talk about embedding key skills. And I think perhaps we could start with a broad question about why we should bother to embed key skills. What is the importance of it in your view?
I think there are two main reasons. The first one is really the legislative one. Since 2007, since the introduction of the reform of teacher training, acknowledging what the government have called the minimum core has been a central feature of both teacher training and also the moves towards staff development for those people already qualified. So there is an element of all teacher training which now looks to acknowledge why it's important to embed literacy, numeracy and ICT. However, teachers have always done it, and they've always done it because it's part of good, effective practice. It's part of good, effective practice because there are lots of both young people and more mature learners who come into classes and they may not have the skills they actually need to not only fulfil their potential at that point, at the level at which you're teaching them, but to progress. And I think as teachers we would always want not only to give our students the qualification they're with us at that moment for, but to be able to get them to go on and achieve. So teachers have always done it, but they haven't done it in as formalised a way. And I know from my own professional practice that lots of teachers have been a little bit unsure about how to do it. So any teacher who's been trained within the last 7 years has actually had chance to think about how they're doing it. And current teachers, it should be a central feature of our practice.
Right. So we've got to do it, but also we ought to do it just because it's purely because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, I personally think it makes our job as teachers a lot easier because, speaking from my own professional background, I've spent a lot of time working with people with literacy and numeracy difficulties. If you can address those difficulties and get those students confident, then it makes your job as a teacher a lot easier because there aren't so many misconceptions in the classroom, there aren't so many misunderstandings, students do better when it comes to their assessments. So actually putting some input in before the final assessment I think makes your job easier, particularly in terms of the marking, etc., because you're actually doing the same thing you're probably doing when you're marking work, you're just preempting that and you're actually thinking about what students might find difficult beforehand.
Right, so to a certain extent we kind of do it anyway as teachers, but I guess we also maybe get a little anxious around it because of that legislative drive for it, and particularly around the terminology associated with it.
Yes.
You know, key skills, basic skills, core skills. Could you just spend a little time kind of delineating what those different terms mean?
Originally, in vocational programmes such as BTECs, there were common or core skills, and those were strands that not only addressed literacy and numeracy and ICT, but also addressed things like teamwork. So if you were teaching a BTEC prior to 2000, you'd be familiar with the idea of common skills, which ran through everything. Those were more formally introduced into the wider post-16 curriculum in 2001, and that was partly in response to the acknowledgement by the government that there were young people leaving school at 16 without the skills they needed in terms of their literacy, numeracy and IT. So from 2001, it became essential for everybody to acknowledge key skills.
Okay.
Key skills.
So we've got common skills to
Key skills.
Okay.
So within the 16 to 19 year age range, or those people who are slightly older who are doing BTEC qualifications, A-level and other vocational qualifications, there was this idea that everybody should embed key skills, so literacy and numeracy, and the three wider key skills, which were improving own learning and performance, problem solving and working with others. So staff were asked to address those. The term basic skills can be quite a confusing one because technically what we mean by basic skills is we mean literacy and numeracy, but possibly at a slightly lower level. The basic skills curriculum starts from what we call the entry level point, and it's particularly looking at working with learners who don't have English as a second language, English as a first language, who are starting from scratch, or who have specific learning difficulties. The major change just recently has been the change to functional skills. And functional skills is a concentration on literacy, numeracy and ICT, which links the post-16, the post-14 curriculum with the school's curriculum. So now both schools and FE, HE training institutions are doing assessment of functional skills. It's the same content. The literacy that's in functional skills is the same literacy that was in common or core skills. It is just another set of terminology. So again, if you've been teaching or training for a while, you will be doing this. The real difference with functional skills is the application. So functional skills is literacy, but not just for literacy's sake. It's applying and using and trying to make literacy a bit more explicit. So everything that you are teaching, not only you're teaching something, but you're trying to explain to students why you're doing it and where it links in with their own everyday roles.
And what about those broader, softer skills that you talked about? Were they lost when we went to functional skills? So about team working and so on?
Yes, they have been lost to a certain extent, and that's simply because of the assessment process, because when there were key skills, whatever qualification you were doing key skills as well. And particularly when you'd got qualifications that were assessed with portfolios, you were doing a lot of elements that were assessed via that form of coursework or portfolio. So your wider key skills, say for example you're working with others, would have been in group presentations. And there were specific criteria for assessing those. Nowadays we're not assessing them, and as teachers we do tend to know that if we're not assessing something, it sometimes isn't as explicit as it would be. But they're still there, they're still a core feature.
Kind of naturally occurring, probably.
Yes.
You get people working together and so on, even if you're not formally assessing it in that way.
I think the difference is as well, particularly if you're looking at working with learners who've come either straight from school, your 16 to 19-year-old learners, or those who've been in education recently, the idea of improving their learning performance is a very key element, because in schools nowadays there's much more of a feature of target setting for the learners. So somebody who's coming through a school system will be used to the idea that I have specific targets for me this term, next term, eventually. And those targets are linked to their longer term goals and qualifications.
Right. Well, that probably leads us on really nicely to my next question, which is about how do we actually do it? You know, here I am a teacher in FE. I know I need to embed functional skills. I'm conscious that my learners are coming in with that as a background to their studies. What do I do? How do I start?
When you start thinking about embedding functional skills, the first step is just to look at what you already do, because you'll probably find that you're doing an awful lot of this anyway. And the best way to do it is to start with either your own scheme of work, or to go back to the module specification, the course outline, whatever documentation you're working on. And just to sit and look at it. I find it's best to do in collaboration, because I find it's really useful for people to feed off each other in terms of ideas. But what you're looking for is you're looking for the sorts of words in that specification or module that will relate to literacy, numeracy or ICT. So if I can give you some examples.
Yes, do.
When we talk about literacy teaching, we normally talk about 3 strands. And those 3 strands are speaking and listening, reading and writing. Now I think all teachers would say that that's part of what they do in their planning. And so when you're looking at those 3 strands, you're looking at opportunities for students to not only speak and listen, but also to improve their skills at speaking and listening. Not only to read, but become more effective readers. And I think this is particularly important when you are looking at progressing learners from the lower levels to the higher levels, because we'll know that the better you are at reading, particularly reading large quantities of information, the more effective you are as a learner. And then writing. So the 3rd strand is in developing your students' writing. So you've got those 3 strands of literacy that you've probably already got in your lesson planning anyway. And it's about making what you do a bit more explicit to the learners. So, for example, you may give your learners a handout, a module outline, particularly at the beginning of a session. You may say to them, this is what we're going to do. One of the strategies I use is to make it very explicit what I want my learners to do in terms of reading that information. And that's to talk to your learners about skimming and scanning.
Okay.
So when you give a piece of text out, you may say to your learners, right, I want you to read this and give me some opinions, give me some impressions. And that's what we call skimming skills, that's reading. But just by saying to your learners, I would like you to read this article and tell me what you think it's about, or give me any thoughts that you have on first reading it. So by that, you are introducing them to the idea that that is a technique they can use.
Yes, a way of handling text.
Yes.
Okay.
Particularly when you're progressing your learners on and they're going to do more independent reading, they're going to be using the library, using more complex texts, understanding that you don't read a whole book cover to cover, you skim read. So getting them to skim read, and then following that on by introducing the idea of scanning. Scanning is where you're looking for specific information. And so skimming is to get a gist of what the passage is about. And scanning is the sort of thing that you can use really effectively with direct questioning. So you could say to your learners, I want you to look at this handout and can anybody find, for example, the date of this particular activity? Or can anybody tell me who's mentioned first in the passage? So it's asking them to read, again quickly, not detailed reading, but you are already giving them either the specific information, you may give them a specific name, or you may be asking them to look for a category, so date, time, place, and so on. But again, tell your students, I'm now going to ask you to scan through this piece of work and look for this particular information. And then when you've done that activity with them, again, it's about making it explicit. It's about saying, now, when you go to the library and do research for your assignment, I would like you to use those skimming techniques, think about the gist, what is the article about, and then when you are looking for specific information, you are using scanning techniques.
And that's skills in terms of their use of existing materials. How about, sort of thinking about developing them in terms of their ability to produce written content? I guess it's a similar sort of...
Yes. In terms of the two strands of reading and writing, they're very, very linked, and we use the phrase receptive and productive literacy. So the receptive literacy is when you are receiving information either in a written form or a spoken form, because you're either listening or you're reading. And there are various things that you can do to improve student skills at receiving information. The most important one in terms of looking at literacy is looking at the type of structure of text that you use. So what types of text you give to your learners, and looking specifically at what they do with it in the classroom. And we use the terminology directed activities related to text, which is abbreviated as DARTS, to sum up a whole range of activities that you can do that help your students to be more receptive to the information that's put in front of them. So an example of a DARTS activity in a receptive way would be when the students are looking through a piece of text, you would ask them to highlight, physically highlight with the pen, keywords or phrases. So that would be one example of a DARTS activity. And again, it's making it explicit. If you look around the classroom, probably your learners that have got higher literacy skills, your learners that are more effective at improving their own learning, will be highlighting already. But it's actually saying to your learners, I would like you all to highlight. Also, depending on the stage at which your learners are at with their receptive skills, starting off small with just highlighting and then maybe asking them to highlight specific things in response to questions from you, or even to the extent of using colour coding. So could you, for example, highlight all the important facts in the piece in one colour, and can you highlight anything that strikes you as particularly unusual in another colour. So getting them to actually engage with the text. This works very well for visual learners as well. It also works very well as a peer assessment tool, because if you've got a group of learners who are working together, they will quite naturally look at it, oh, I didn't notice, oh, that's really interesting. Because if you've got people reading silently, they don't know whether they're taking in the correct information, whereas it makes it more collaborative learning activity. And I would usually follow that up by sharing as well some peer assessments, saying, could you just look and see if you've got the same information as your partner. You can follow that up in terms of making students then do productive activities by taking that idea of, for example, key terminology in a subject area, and then creating some very small activities related to that. So, for example, if you've introduced a piece of text, got them to highlight some key vocabulary, you might need to focus on that key vocabulary. So you could, for example, get them to use a piece of new vocabulary in another sentence form. So get them each to write a sentence. So, for example, in my session this afternoon, one of the pieces of key terminology was taxonomy. So I introduced the subject of taxonomy to my learners, got them to say the word, established that we knew what it meant, and then got them to think about how they would use that in a sentence. Again, you can either make this a very, very short activity, just get them to tell each other how they would use taxonomy, or get them to write it down. And it's just thinking about extending that vocabulary, so we're not only reading it, we're understanding it. And this is where you can start to bring in the use of IT.
Okay.
What I encourage my learners to do is, whenever they don't understand a word, we used to have dictionaries on the table, now most people have mobile phones, I say use whatever device you have, just look up not only that word, but again, once you've got them used to looking at that word, thinking about the word in its wider context. What's the opposite?
Yeah.
What are related words? And then again, making that a little bit more explicit. So if you've got a learner to look up the word taxonomy, establish what it means, say, what other words could we use instead of taxonomy? When you're writing your essays, you may think of a word to use, but sometimes there are other words that are better. So just gradually introducing them to the idea that there are lots of related words, and some of them might be better because the more vocabulary they use, they're likely to do better in their assessments at the end.
Okay, you've started to move there a little bit into ICT, and I don't know about you, but my experience has been that generally people are rather more confident with introducing literacy, and after that perhaps ICT. The one that seems to me to be most challenging to people, particularly if they're not mathematicians or scientists, is numeracy. So have you got any recommendations for how we can get number into our specialisms if they're not central to it?
The thing is recognising where it is. There's a number in every single specialism, but I think people, because they've tended to do maths as a discrete subject at school, and most of us had our own education in an era where there weren't the links made. You see mathematics as something that you did and you've forgotten about, and put it to one side. But the real thing with numeracy is don't think about maths, think about number. And again, look at your subject specification and look at where there is number, and number in its widest sense. So number as date, as time, and that links very much into chronology as well. So thinking about when things happened, were they before or after? So encouraging your students to think about, for example, sequencing activities. Also thinking about number as money. Virtually all subjects have money in them in some way, and particularly if you're dealing with subjects such as business or law. One of the really, really good strategies I use a lot for number is, rather than giving students information that you might want to give them in terms of, you might want to talk about, for example, profit or loss, or an example with law, you might want to talk about awards that are given by courts for certain cases. Rather than giving them the information, you give them part of the information and you ask them to work things out. And that's a really simple way of introducing some numeracy into your lessons without students even realising that they're doing it. So for example, if you're looking at profit or loss, you might want to give a number of different figures and say to those, what was the highest? What's the highest figure there? What's the lowest figure? Okay, what's the difference between them? Or you could look at a number of different years and say to this, okay, not very useful to have all these different figures here. What would probably be more useful is if we knew on average what the figure was. And again, it's just about introducing a very, very simple step. Again, supported by the use of their handheld technology, because most people have phones that they can use as calculators. And I think the way that I found most effective is to do it collaboratively, to get them to work out together, and most importantly, to get a consensus from the group about checking answers, because that we're feeding into improving own learning and performance. So saying to each group, well, what's your answer?
So developing their skills of working collaboratively.
Yes, and checking each other and supporting each other.
Yeah.
The other big area, not just number as in time and money and date, but in statistics. We all use statistics, but we don't necessarily talk about the statistics, and we don't encourage our learners to question them.
Right.
So if you are putting up a pie chart or a bar chart or a line graph on your board, talk about it as what it represents. Talk about it as a piece of number, as a piece of information, but also start using direct questioning to try and encourage your students to actually think about, why is it a pie chart? So if you think about what makes a pie chart effective.
Yes, why is that being chosen rather than a bar chart or rather than a line graph?
Yes.
Okay.
Looking at the relationship between the pie chart and what it's representing. So, for example, a pie chart represents a whole thing. How much is that whole thing? And some very, very simple questioning which help your students understand the relationship between percentages and fractions. So, looking at a pie chart and just saying, oh, looking at this sector here, do you think that's more than half? Less than half? Is it bigger than a quarter? Less than a quarter? How many? And again, developing the idea of asking questions, saying, well, what's the smallest segment? How many people does that relate to? What's that as a percentage? So it's just using questions that you don't have to answer. Your learners just have to think, yeah, 10%. Is that a large amount? And by doing that, you're actually developing their numeracy in the context of the subject without making them work out.
Yes.
10%.
Yeah, I mean that links really to my final question, which was around what to do if you're not confident yourself with regard to any of these areas, with regard to use of ICT or number. You know, if my skills, I'm kind of worried that I'm not brilliant with number. What do I do with that?
I think the thing, first of all, is to recognise that this is very much a developmental process, because people who have been teaching literacy and numeracy for a long time can almost immediately see where it is. But it's more about recognising opportunities within your teaching and just taking very small steps to develop those opportunities. So looking at where, say, your reading, your writing appears within your scheme of working and lesson planning, starting to develop small activities and importantly reflecting on them. And by that, you will soon see where your own gaps in subject knowledge are. And there are lots and lots of resources available for you. There are lots of resources available for you in terms of developing your own personal skills if you feel you're not quite certain about things like the possessive apostrophe, or you still get a bit stuck on spelling, or you're not certain about the relationship between fractions and decimals and percentages. So there are a number of resources such as the BBC SkillsWise site and the resources on a tutor created site called Skills Workshop, But there are also, more importantly, a number of resources that have already been created of examples of embedded literacy and numeracy, from lesson plans, schemes of work, to just small sample activities that you can do. So they've been collected together. They were developed under the government's Read Write Plus strategy, which looked at addressing the skills of the adult population, and they're now available through the Excellence Gateway site. So there are what we call contextualised activities at different levels. So there are ready-made lesson plans and resources that you can look at. And the interesting thing is, when you look at those, you will find your own lessons there. You will find your lesson on whatever topic, but it will just have the literacy or the numeracy or the ICT made a bit more explicit.
Yeah, highlighted a little bit.
So it's what you're doing already, it's just a slightly different way of thinking about what you're doing.
Okay.
And it is about setting yourself just a few goals, and then once you're confident with that, then you can start extending it. And reflecting as well on how that activity went with the learners, because the more you talk to them about their literacy and numeracy, the more they're likely to tell you about the areas that they feel they need help with. So you will tend to find that you get feedback from learners, things like them telling you they don't understand vocabulary, or interestingly, a lot of the time, people can read a word, but they don't know how to say it. So by having some just very informal conversations about, do we know what that means? I was using an example with my law students today, and I used the word taught. Now, taught is one of those peculiar words in the English language. Yes, T-O-R-T if you're a lawyer, but if you're making some French apple flan, it could be spelled differently. If you're talking about something that's tight, or you could say, I was taught to ride by my mum. And just by saying to your learners, well, we're using this word, does anybody know that word in a different meaning? It just very, very gently outlines the fact that there's more than one spelling of the word.
Okay, yeah, so doing it subtly.
Very subtly.
I think there's some key messages from me from what you've been saying there. The key things that strike me about what you've said is start with what you're already doing and find the key skills that are already there. I think your recommendations to introduce it into your lessons through questioning and through drawing out what your students can do, and then knowing how to help them and support them to move on, is really valuable to me. But it seems to me that the most important thing is this notion that we began with, which is that it's actually not centrally about the legislation, although of course we all need to comply, but that it's centrally about developing our learners and giving them the skills that they need to move on.
Yes, because I was doing some work with a local FE college, and they're looking at developing their skills, and he was saying to me that in previous years he's had staff who come and said, oh, it would be lovely if this particular student could get a higher grade, but they can't because they lack the language skills to do it. And I think, as he said, that sums it up really, because if we can develop students' language and numeracy skills, then they will be able to achieve those higher grades. And that's what we all want. We want our learners to achieve, and we want to improve their motivation to succeed. And there's nothing worse than losing a learner from your class because they feel demotivated because they can't access what you're giving them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Alison.